So I want to argue today that really in order to develop a nuanced understanding of governance in small cities, we need to capture institutional heterogeneity and the influence of associational life on the ways that these cities are governed in the everyday. To do so, we really need to be attentive to the forms of influence and governance actors that may not be reflected in the influential literature on South Asian urban studies, which is really embedded in the realities of India's metropolises. And while private capital and middle-class public lobby groups, be they environmental lobbies or RWAs, for example, might be very influential in Delhi, Mumbai, and Bangalore, in small cities, it might be the local but surprisingly well-connected and internationally linked Rotary Club that's influential and responsible for slum demolitions, as it was in Navsari, or the subtle and often overlooked influence of neighborhood-based social clubs that territorialize the city and shape governance by and beyond the state, as it is in Birmingham. So I'm drawing today on a 3-year Small Cities, Urban Environments and Governance in India project, which was funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, led by René Veron at the University of Lausanne. My doctoral work was part of that project. I was responsible for fieldwork in West Bengal. Anna Zimmer was the postdoc on the project responsible for fieldwork in Gujarat. And in that project, we really tried to examine the processes and practices of environmental governance through the lens of urban political ecology in 4 small cities. We chose small cities really explicitly that were district headquarters, so they had a certain level of governance actors, a certain penetration of the state, but were not recipients of significant funds from the small cities component of JNE-NURM, so that was the UIDSMMT, something like that. Nor were they otherwise economically or politically remarkable. So we automatically excluded, for example, the cities in the north of West Bengal, or ecologically sensitive. So as much as we really wanted to go to the Rann of Kutch, we excluded those cities too. So our primary field sites in the end were Bardhaman in West Bengal, a population of about 314,000, urban agglomeration a bit bigger than that, and the Navsari Vijalpur urban agglomeration, which has a population a little bit smaller, about 283,000. Secondary field sites were Amreli and Mindapur. Over the course of about 10 months of field research in both states, we conducted over 300 interviews with bureaucrats, political leaders, members of civil society in various forms, as well as households. These interviews really focused on the governance of water bodies, solid waste, and green spaces, as well as experiences of state and governance networks. We launched a small exploratory survey as well, and experimented a little bit with participatory photography. Ran out of time and various issues to take that a little bit farther, unfortunately. So preaching here to the choir a little bit, but as I said, South Asian urban studies really dominated by case studies and theorizing from the metropolises. And this work has provided really important theoretical insights into the ways that politics, capital, and situated socioeconomic and sociopolitical factors shape the reproduction of India's cities. So it's been captured, for example, with Asher Gertner's ideas of rule by aesthetic, or Bhavaskar's notion of bourgeoisie environmentalism. While some of the rhetoric, if not the effects, that underlies or is underlined by these processes have applicability in smaller centers, the drivers, both in terms of actors and political economic factors of these and the effects, are quite different. And for this reason, I think that often these insights don't map easily onto the context of a lot of small cities. And India's small cities really remain understudied, so I'm always excited when there's new projects exploring them, and increasingly attention is being given to these cities. And as I read it, I think that the kind of emerging body of research has really highlighted, on the one hand, the fundamental connectedness of these cities to multiple elsewheres, but also the need to take particularities of the complex constitutive power relations and the particular histories of these cities seriously. So this has, for example, been really well highlighted with Mueller and Down's work on Leh, where they track how this kind of shifting imaginary of Leh from a trade center to a dangerous periphery and now to a romantic mountain town has shaped the way that the urban nature is governed. Or Andrea Hagen's work on Puri, who's really explored how the very specific socio-religious history of Puri shapes access to and exclusion from RAI, which was a housing program billed as inclusive and integrated. And has really interesting, I think, connections to the choice of case studies that you guys have made in those two. So the analysis emerging from these researchers in short, highlight the complexity of governance networks in these cities on the one hand, and the difference in relative influence and involvement of different actors. Our work in Gujarat and West Bengal has been important in highlighting that fact as well. So I'm going to highlight 2 case studies. In the Navsari urban agglomeration in Gujarat, we explored the spatial reordering of the city center in a project that allowed for the beautification and redevelopment of a water reservoir that you can see here. So one element of this project involved the displacement of marginalized urban residents from the center of town in what was billed as a needed move to allow for the beautification and protection of a water reservoir to a peripheral site that they were forced to share on a temporary 2-year-long basis with a municipal garbage dump. So this displacement was not initially motivated, interestingly, by the state's desire to reform the city's image, nor by private real estate development or middle-class activist groups per se, as one might expect from the literature. Rather, the impetus really came from a private citizen, one who saw the potential, as he said it, to make the area beautiful and a nice way to walk. And he was also concerned, he claimed, for water contamination due to the presence of slum dwellers and open defecation practices. So he approached the municipality with the idea, and through his service club's international connections with the global network of Rotary clubs, he was able to secure the needed funds to build houses for those who were displaced and to relocate those because of the project. As is common with most slum relocations, not everyone who lived there actually received housing, but that's a bit of a separate issue. This case study, I think, is really important for a number of reasons, not all of which I have time to get into. But key among these is demonstrating that the processes of urban restructuring in smaller, supposedly less globalized cities may still depend on global flows and connections. The global financial flows that are important here are, like I said, not real estate developers or other private sources, but really connected to civil society and associational life. However, the effects of these flows in enabling further spatial reordering of the city center and really the further marginalization of the poor must be understood as inherently and deeply political. The globality here, though, is quantitatively and qualitatively different than what we see in a lot of the research on metropolises. And in West Bengal, we also focus on urban water bodies. So urban water bodies were used as a heuristic, so ponds and lakes, basically, to understand the complex network of actors who shape the urban environment. So in this city, the water bodies are important as water, but also for pisciculture. And here we examine the relationship between neighborhood-based social clubs as a contextually embedded institution and the production of para as a socio-spatial entity in context as a governable space. So while these clubs frame themselves as explicitly not political and not connected to the party, interactions with them are inherently political and allow the club, as an institution, to really influence how certain resources and spaces are governed in the everyday. And in a later paper that's currently under review, I've explored the ways that the clubs territorialize the city in order to create governable space, where they're both an alternative to and an alternate to, or an intermediary rather, with the state. And demonstrating in turn the ways that associational life may be profoundly political and the need to recognize institutions beyond the state and the party. And in the case of West Bengal, this kind of call to recognize institutions beyond political parties may seem obvious. But in West Bengal, political parties really do play an outsized role in the governance of cities, and in turn, in the literature on urban politics and governance, which is really dominated by the analysis of parties, particularly the Communist Party, a 30-year-long rule. And indeed, the party is really omnipresent as a social institution, and not just, and even times primarily as a political one, and having ties to it, even informal, can be a key determinant of your ability to access resources, be they water bodies, or to make a call to get sewerage in your neighborhood, or piped water infrastructure, things of this nature. And can also allow you really to violate, at times blatantly, the legal rights of access of others. These ties as well can interestingly offset other forms of socioeconomic marginalization, inserting individual actors into governance networks in really unique ways. And really exploring these very embedded relationships and the sources of power that underpin them has highlighted the complexity and diffuse nature of power relations exerted over and through the urban environment. So in sum, really, both of these case studies are reflective of the broader landscape in the small cities that we investigated. These cities are really marked by a level of institutional heterogeneity that extends beyond what might be expected on the basis of the literature. Importantly, they demonstrate that the ways that self-defined, not political forms of associational life, such as the Rotary Club or the Bengali social clubs, may act in explicitly and powerfully political ways. Understanding how different forms of associational life, then, may take on roles of governance actors and intersect with complex governance networks that shape the city requires a level of attention, I think, to different temporalities, as governance actors may enter and seed from spaces of governance. So, for example, the gentleman with the Rotary Club, this wasn't his normal role. He was just kind of a normal businessman, but became quite important, as well as this kind of diversity of actors. Further, in researching small cities, there's a need to recognize and account for different forms of globality and urban aspirations that may or may not come into play. And I beat the time limit for once in my academic career.